Danielle Steel Family Ties. Annie didn't see Ted or Katie until the following day, and she mentioned to them both that she was going to Whitney and Fred's on New Year's Eve. Had they objected, she would have cancelled, but as Whitney had predicted, they both said they had plans with friends. Annie didn't say another word to Katie about Paul. She had said enough, and Katie was still angry at her when Annie left for New Jersey on the afternoon of New Year's Eve. Annie arrived at Whitney and Fred's house in Far Hills at 6 o'clock. There had been very little traffic, and she made good time. She had brought a simple black evening dress and hung it in the back seat. Their three boys were playing basketball in the backyard when she arrived. They were 14, 16, and 17, and all three of them looked like Fred, with freckles and red hair. They were all sports nuts like their father, and their oldest son was currently applying to college. He wanted to go to Duke and do pre-med like his father. The boys waved to her when she arrived. Fred was an orthopedic surgeon and had done well. She wasn't a man whom Annie would have chosen, but Whitney was happy and had a good life with him. He had a big ego and had always been impressed with himself, but he was a good father and husband, a good provider and a responsible person. Annie had always respected him for that. As she walked into their house after Whitney hugged her, Annie saw that the dining table was beautifully set with gleaming silver and crystal, and there were white flowers and silver streamers everywhere. The evening looked more elaborate than she had expected. "How many people are you having?" Annie asked, feeling nervous. She knew that most of their friends were married and were part of a tight circle of people who lived in Far Hills, and many of them were physicians like Fred. She always felt a little strange in their midst, like an outsider or some kind of freak. She tried not to think of it now. "We are having 24, Whitney said as she helped carry Annie's things to her room. It was a beautiful guest room, and Whitney had thought of every detail. "How was Katie when you left?" "Still pissed. I have hardly seen her for the past few days. She said she had plans with friends. I didn't ask. But isn't probably Paul?" "She will be fine," Whitney said. "Take a day off. Have some fun yourself tonight. The guests are coming at 7. We will sit down to dinner at 8 or 8:30. It didn't give Annie much time to get dressed, and she sank into the tub a few minutes after Whitney left the room. She had promised herself she was going to make an effort and get into the spirit of the evening. Annie blew her hair dry and did it in a French twist. She put her makeup on carefully and stepped into the black dress, and she wore a pair of high-heeled sandals with feathers on them that Lizzie had bought her in Paris, and she put on diamond earrings that she had bought herself. She checked herself in the mirror before she left her room and decided that her fashionable niece Lizzie would approve, and she carried a small black satin clutch. Annie looked sleek and sophisticated as she left her room, just as the first guest arrived and walked into the living room. They were a couple she had met before. He was an orthopedic surgeon like Fred, and his wife was a friend of Whitney's with kids the same age. And Annie remembered that they always drank a little too much. The couple looked Annie over as she walked in. The couple looked Annie over as she walked in, and the wife had the smug, condescending look that some married women give single ones, as though they feel sorry for them. Annie wouldn't have traded her own life for hers, but she chatted amiably with them as other guests continued to arrive. By 8 o'clock, everyone was there. People arrived promptly in the suburbs, unlike big cities, where everyone was late, and she hadn't figured out which one her blind date was at. All the men in the room had punches and looked middle-aged, and most of the women were slightly overweight. Whitney was too, although she was as tall as Annie and carried it well. Annie always suspected that the excess weight was because most of the women drank a little too much wine. Annie had a better figure than anyone in the room, and she was intrigued to discover that the women ignored her, and the men stood in clumps with each other, discussing business or medicine. The men acted as though the women didn't exist, and the women didn't seem to care, and talked about shopping, tennis, or their kids. "Did you see him?" Whitney asked as she stopped to chat with Annie for a minute, then drifted away again. She was busy with her guests. She had introduced Annie to a few people, all of them couples, and Annie had figured out that she and her blind date were probably the only single people in the room. But she didn't spotted him yet. All she knew from Whitney was that he was 52, a surgeon, drove a Porsche, and was divorced. It would have been hard to identify him from that description unless she had seen him get out of car alone. The women in the room were wearing cocktail dresses or evening gowns, and the men were in black tie, but no one looked really chic, and they seemed a little overdressed. It was 5 minutes before they sat down to dinner when Whitney brought him over to meet her and introduced her to Bob Graham, the man she was dying for Annie to meet. And as she saw him, Annie's heart sank. He looked like every blind date she had ever had, and she looked her over like a piece of meat. He looked like every bad blind date she had ever had, and he looked her over like a piece of meat. He told her immediately that he was a surgeon and specialized in heart-lung transplants, and he looked as though he expected applause. He looked moderately athletic but still had a paunch and several chins, and he had very bad hair plugs done the year before when he got divorced. Annie would have preferred if he were bald. Annie would have preferred it if he were bald, and she tried to remind herself to be a good sport and give the poor guy a chance. What if he were the nicest man on the planet and had bad hair plugs? It would be worth putting up with his hair if he were a wonderful human being, and maybe he was, or fascinating, or funny, or extremely smart. Anything was possible. She saw him staring at her diamond earrings. She saw him staring at her diamond earrings, and he cut to the chase.